Our next presenter, professional life, combined, is another intimidating person, of course. Combined higher education and journalism. Touched my heart. He taught at Michigan State University, then at State University of New York, Binghamton. After working in politics for several years, God bless him, he will get a lot of purgatory for that. He became the politics editor of the New Republic, and then a national political correspondent, as we all met him at NBC News. He covered political campaigns, elections, presidents, from Jimmy Carter through George W. Bush. He joined CNN as a political analyst and documentary reporter, later became a moderator. I thought this was a great job for him. It was perfect. Washington Week in Review on PBS. He received an Emmy. He should have gotten 5. But he received an Emmy for the 1988 documentary, The Public Mind of George Bush. He wrote a weekly column for the Indianapolis Star, and in 2005 was inducted into the Indiana Journalism Hall of Fame. 1998, became Dean of the School of Journalism at Northwestern University, and has now retired. How do you do that? Oh, that's great. I have to ask him after this. He has written for the Political Science Quarterly, American University, Law Review, where our paths crossed, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Playboy, and most recently, I never got anybody from Playboy to ask me to write anything. What a drag. Son of a gun. Even Jimmy Carter wrote for Playboy, but not me. And most recently, the Antioch Review. That's great. To introduce the 2013 fiction winner. Here is our friend Ken Bode. He's in the house. Please, welcome.
I hope this is the nonfiction winner. You know, when you sign up, you're invited to come to be a judge in this esteemed prize. You sign up for it, and it's an honor to be asked, and you say to yourself, well, they're going to send me 6 books on the 1st of August, and I have to have my work done by the 1st of September. First thing you say to yourself is, well, there goes August. And Sharon then sends the books. And I begin, as they arrive, I begin to organize them in a pile and so forth. Organize them by size and see how much time it's going to take each one. Then comes Andrew Solomon. Sweet Jesus, I said to myself, I hope this is good. 700 pages, 100 pages of notes. On top of that, as one critic remarked, this is not a pocket guide. Far from the tree, the old adage that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. What Andrew Solomon did is just took this adage and turned it on its head to see what happens when it does. What happens when it falls perhaps an orchard away from the tree? And what happens when the little fellow or girl that the stork delivers is nothing like what you expected? When biology intercedes and chromosomes are abnormal, well, with birth, if you read this book, you know there are no guarantees. On the first page, Andrew Solomon says, there is no such thing as reproduction, only acts of production. Not something you can do anything about. Parenting, he says, is not a sport for perfectionists. In the course of this book, and the core of this book, he postulates what he calls horizontal identities, a rupture that occurs between the child's life and the parent's expectations when you just don't get what you thought was coming. and he deals with 10 different conditions: Down syndrome, autism, schizophrenia, deafness, dwarfism, children conceived in rape, transgender, prodigies, and others. What happens when you look down at your baby and realize that life has become suddenly unknowable, that parenting for you is now going to be a long, long walk in the dark? Solomon accumulated case studies with 300 families over a period of many years. It's a massive accumulation of evidence and a breathtakingly humane examination of families who know that their children must pursue life on an entirely different playing field from other children. It's a book how parents meet these challenges and how sometimes they don't or can't. Sometimes they have to say, if I'd known it was going to be this deal, I would not have done it. Andrew is a master storyteller. In the chapter on dwarfs, he takes the reader to the Little People of America Conference, an annual place where they go where everything from dancing to talent shows is designed for little bodies. It's also a once-in-a-year opportunity for dating. And I don't want you to think that this is a heavy book to read. It is not. It's a very inspirational book and a sometimes very funny book. As with the dwarfs who say, you know, one thing we all have in common is that when we go to the movie theater, we can't just slip our arms up around our date and let them slide down and touch her breast. Our arms are just too short. Solomon writes about his and his own family's challenges as well. And he writes about his dyslexia and the realization that he is gay, his marriage and how he and his partner created their own family. And these things, knowing these things about the author, make the reader, or give the reader, a real insight for understanding about how he engaged so meaningfully with the people he interviewed, how intimately he engaged with the families that he interviewed. For me, reading this book was a steep learning curve. In virtually every one of these abnormalities, I learned tons about what I ever knew or even imagined, including the revelation of what happened when a horizontal identity appeared in my own extended family and gave me a better understanding of it and a better capacity for appreciating it. I'm glad that Sharon made me read this book, and I'm pleased to welcome Andrew Solomon to come and claim the award he so definitely deserves.
Thank you. Thank you. It is, of course, a tremendous, tremendous honor to receive this prize. I don't think it's possible for anyone to receive anything called a Peace Prize without a feeling of great emotion attached to it. And I'm grateful for those eloquent and generous words of introduction. And I'm grateful to be here with the other authors who are receiving or finalists for the prize this year. It's been a real thrill, and it's been a very warm welcome in Dayton, I think, for all of us. Even in purely non-religious terms, homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life. As such, it deserves no glamorization, no rationalization, and above all, no pretense that it is anything but a pernicious sickness. That was Time magazine in 1966, when I was 3 years old. And in the last year, both the President of the United States and the Supreme Court have expressed support for gay marriage. And I set out to write this book, determined to understand how that had happened, how something that had been universally assumed to be an illness had turned into, instead, an identity. And I wanted to look at what other things that we think of as illnesses could become identities. And in the course of doing that, I wanted to look at how the liberation movements have gone in single file. There was the women's suffrage movement, there was the civil rights movement, of which Thurgood Marshall was an important part. There was the gay rights movement. There now begin to be movements for disability rights and for rights for people with other forms of difference. I was engaged by the idea that each movement relies on the one that came before, but struck by the fact that sometimes the people who have managed to make a transition can be a little bit ungenerous with the people who are behind them. So all of the gay people wanted to say we're just like all of those black people you gave rights to a few years ago. But there was some resistance initially from some members, certainly not from all, but from some members of the civil rights movement to that appropriation of their history. And I decided that instead of merely huddling on the sort of safe far side of the ravine with the others who had been accepted, that I would look and see who was in line next and who was coming along behind us. And that became the guiding principle of my book. When I was perhaps 6 years old, I went with my mother and my brother to a shoe store. And at the end of getting our shoes fitted, we were told that each of us could have a balloon, and we could choose the color of balloon we wanted. And my brother wanted a red balloon, and I wanted a pink balloon. And my mother said that she thought I would really rather have a blue balloon. And I said, no, I really wanted the pink balloon. And she reminded me that my favorite color was blue. The fact that my favorite color now is blue, but I'm still gay, gives you some evidence of my mother's influence and its limits. It was a very different world then, and she wanted to protect me from prejudice and to protect me from the possibility of never having a family of my own, because she thought that having a family was one of life's greatest joys. And what has happened since then is that the world has shifted and changed. But we can never be complacent about that shifting and changing, and we can never assume that because there's been progress, onward progress is inevitable. This morning, I was with the other award recipients at an event at which we all spoke, and at the end of it, I was walking out of the theater and up the aisle through an audience of people who had chosen to come to an event for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. And one man pulled me aside and said, but you've got to admit that this gay rights thing has gone too far. And I said, no, I don't see that I have to admit that. He said, it's influencing children. It's a terrible thing. It has to be brought under control. One runs up against these things more often than one would think. One is running up against them now in looking at the attitudes of the corporations who are sponsoring the Olympics in Sochi, most of whom have refused to take any stance whatsoever about the current laws against homosexual propaganda that are flying in Russia. It's devastating to see that lack of support. In the introduction, you heard a bit about my idea of vertical versus horizontal identity. I would add to that the idea that all parents have effectively two obligations. One is to change our children. We want to educate them, we want to teach them hygiene, we want to teach them manners. Not to change your children is to neglect them and is a terrible crime. But we also need to accept our children for who they are. And there are some things that are clearly unchangeable and that we clearly need only to accept. And there are some things that clearly need to be altered and changed. And then there's a lot that's in the middle. And we don't know what the boundary should be between the changing and the accepting. And we don't know what the boundary should be between the love that has presumably been there from the very beginning and the attempt to wrap our minds around children who are essentially very different than we are. There have been generations of activists who have worked toward bringing about these changes. Everyone is aware that there's been a shift in the way that we think about gay people. But let me give you another quote from the Atlantic Monthly in 1968. That was then, of course, considered a bastion of liberal opinion. An ethicist wrote, "There is no reason to feel guilty about putting a Down syndrome child away, whether it is put away in the sense of hidden in a sanitarium or in a more responsible, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from an offense against a person, and a Downs is not a person." We've developed, these various exceptions notwithstanding, a more tolerant society, a society which embraces difference of every kind more readily, a society that's more open to the idea that human diversity matters just as much as species diversity does, a society which looks to the idea that we can all learn to love the children we have, that we can all learn to love and respect the citizenry that we have. Since the time when that was published, the outcome for people with Down syndrome has been changed beyond recognition. People with Down syndrome now live more than twice as long as they did when that was published. Their educational attainments, because of innovations in modes of education for people with DS, have been extraordinary. One woman I know who worked for many years with people who had intellectual disabilities described going out to lunch with the person who plays the Down syndrome role and who himself has Down syndrome on Glee. And she said people came over to the table and asked for his autograph. And she said he was a celebrity first and a person with a disability second. And I never imagined I would live to see a day when that was possible. It's an extraordinary kind of progress. And I found, as I talked to parents over and over again about what it was like to have children who had these various kinds of difference, they were cataloged in the introduction, so I won't go through them all again, but many of them things that seem undesirable. Some of them, like being a prodigy, things that actually seem desirable but represent enormous challenges and differences of their own. What I found over and over again was that people had ended up achieving this remarkable thing, not only of loving, but also of accepting their children. I think over and over again of what one woman said after her very, very, very severely disabled son, who had neither speech nor the ability to walk, and who might to a casual observer have seemed fairly inert, but who was richly human to her, after he died tragically through caregiver neglect. She said at the interment of his ashes, "Let me bury here the rage I feel to have been twice robbed, once of the child I wanted, and once of the son I loved." Now, I don't mean to say that having a disability in the family is an automatically joyful experience, or that it doesn't come with enormous anguish and enormous difficulty of various kinds. And I was interested in where this resilience came from that allowed families to do so well, some of the families I was writing about, and how they could do so well even as they described such agonizing experiences and such personal agony. And one of the people I interviewed said to me, quite wonderfully I think, also the mother of 2 children with very severe disabilities, she said, "People always regale us with these little sayings like, God doesn't give you any more than you can handle. But children like ours are not preordained as a gift. They're a gift because that's what we have chosen." I ended up finding that many of the people I interviewed were grateful for lives that they would have done anything to avoid. And I ended up thinking that the negotiation of difference within a family is actually something that everyone deals with. I've yet to meet anyone who hasn't occasionally looked at his or her son or daughter and said, "What planet did you come from?" And I think that by looking at these more extreme forms of difference, we gain some insight into the general practice that parents have of reconciling with the ways that their children are alien or foreign to them. And so I think, ironically, that difference is what unites us, that the negotiation of these differences is actually a thing that almost all of humanity has in common. And that while each of the individual differences can be very isolating, only so many families dealing with schizophrenia, only so many families of people who are transgender, only so many families of dwarfs, that actually if you look at the commonalities in those experiences, you discover an enormous and very powerful community whose time has come. We think of peace much of the time as something we bring to or seek for in war and peace situations, many of them in faraway places involving organized armies embarked on terrible missions. But I think that my receiving this prize today is to me a message that there is some recognition that peace, like charity, begins at home. There has to be peace within the individual. There has to be peace in the encounter between that individual and the family. There has to be peace in the way that family is integrated into a larger society. And when that happens, there can be a negotiation of peace beyond the confines of that society and in the larger world. I think that idea of an embracing peace that begins in the individual and extends outward is a very beautiful idea, and I'm deeply, deeply honored to accept this award with that view in mind. Thank you.
I told you. Listen to me next time. You're going to hear things you never thought you would ever hear, and hear them in a way you never thought you would hear them. You've done that all throughout this evening, as you just did there. And what things stuck in your head. Arms too short to encompass breasts. Mine had that problem and never achieved that fantasy in every motion picture house in southern Ohio and northern Kentucky, ever. And children that we, who is this? Who is that person? From what planet did he come? Only on October 1st did I learn what planet my son came from. He was lucky enough to be with Sandra Bullock at the time. Remarkable, remarkable. Clearly we need only to accept. Boy, that will burn in there for a while.